Hi, my name is David Essig. I live on Protection Island in the beautiful harbor of Nanaimo. And I came to Canada in 1971 and have been here ever since. That's a little over 50 years, 51 years. I started playing the guitar when I was in junior high school, I guess I was about 13 or 14. And I picked up the banjo first. Like so many of us, I wanted to learn to play five-string banjo like Pete Seeger. You know, those were the days, the early days of the folk, kind of the folk boom in North America. And I switched from banjo over to guitar when I discovered the kind of harmonic limitations of the banjo. And then I got into playing guitar, and I played in bands all through high school and college. I was in a band that was signed to a major record contract with Decca Records in New York City. We had one hit that made it up to number 42, I think, on Billboard. And then our manager ran away with the money, and the band broke up, and Decca, which was a kind of a mafia outfit at the time, let us go, as it were. We were lucky to just get out of there, really. And that was kind of the sum and substance of my career as a pop musician. And I realized what I really wanted to do was play acoustic music, folk music, roots. I played a lot of blues, and I had this wonderful kind of two trains running in my life back then, particularly when I was in college. I started working in a music store, and the music store was basically operated by all the members of the Country Gentlemen, which was a legendary bluegrass group from the United States that later kind of morphed into the Seldom Scene, and they were in that kind of second generation of great traditional bluegrass musicians. And John Duffy, who was the mandolin player, he and I were really good friends, and he taught me to play the mandolin, he taught me how to play dobro, showed me a lot of stuff on guitar. So I was learning all this bluegrass, but in those days, Washington, D.C., which is where I was from, was a pretty, even though it was the capital of the United States, there was still kind of a lot of racial tension. So black music and white music didn't mix very much. So on the one hand, I was learning to play bluegrass from these legendary bluegrass musicians in the Country Gentlemen. On the other hand, I discovered that the Library of Congress in Washington was beginning to bring some of the traditional Delta blues musicians up to D.C. to record them in a studio they had at the Library of Congress, and kind of help them to reestablish their careers, because these were old black blues musicians who had been down in the southern states, and then in the 20s, in the 30s, and then the Depression and war came along, and they kind of faded into oblivion, and collectors went down and found these gentlemen and ladies and brought them up to Washington and recorded them, and they kind of moved them in. So I got to know one of them really well, who was Mississippi John Hurt, because they rented him an apartment down the street from our music store. And he used to come in and buy guitar strings from me. I was behind the counter in the store. And I got to know him a little bit, and we sort of took him around because he didn't have any friends. It was, in a way, it was a kind of heartless thing to do, to bring these guys up to a big city they'd never been in before and just kind of plant them there while they documented their art. And I mean, it was good for the art, but it wasn't so good for them personally. So we did our best to kind of help them along and be friends to them. And it was a wonderful two-way relationship, because I learned so much. I got to know Skip James and Elizabeth Cotton and John Jackson, who all played in that kind of amalgam of the Delta blues and then what was called Piedmont blues, more of a finger-picking style of blues. And I grew up in those two traditions, and they rarely crossed because of racism. And in fact, I remember one of the first times I played at the Mariposa Folk Festival in Canada, in Toronto. I was on Toronto Island. I was in a mandolin workshop, and there were some black guys in the workshop and some white guys, and one of the black guys broke a string on his mandolin, and I was the host, and I said, "Oh, can you use your mandolin?" And the white guy almost didn't want the black guy to touch his mandolin. That's how bad it was. That would be 1972. Of course, thank God things have progressed since then. I don't think that would ever be an issue anymore. But in those days, it's the way it was. And that was kind of the crest of that. And then after that, it was a whole lot better. So I grew up in those two disparate traditions of music, and really it was so much the same music. It's like They have a saying in Nashville, Tennessee, that it's only 90 miles to Memphis. And the rhythm and blues and country music are so much the same. You only have to listen to Jerry Lee Lewis for 5 minutes to hear that, or Waylon Jennings. And then when I was in university and in graduate school, I discovered that, and it was from listening to people like Bill Monroe and Muddy Waters, I discovered these guys were making up their own songs. A lot of the songs they were singing and playing, they figured them out themselves. It wasn't all just the roots of the tradition and they were just reinterpreting things that have been around forever. They were creating their own material. So I got into songwriting, and that's when it really came to me, because I had developed my facility on the guitar to the point that I could accompany myself, and I accompanied a lot of other people too, but I could accompany myself, and I started to write songs. So around 1970, I was starting to write songs that I felt comfortable playing for other people. And I used to go to like open mic nights and coffee houses and stuff, and I would play these songs that I'd written, and they seemed to have some currency with the audience. And so I was feeling pretty confident about that. And then when I left school, I finished my schoolwork, and I decided, rather than to pursue an academic career as an economist, that I would come to Canada and become a folk singer. The war in Vietnam was on, Nixon bombed Cambodia. When that happened, Joan Baez said, you shouldn't pay your taxes. I thought, I've got one better, I'm just getting out of here. And I wasn't eligible for the draft because my eyes were really bad. But ironically, I was on the university rifle team, so suddenly I was eligible because they needed guys who could do what I could do. And I thought, I got to get out of here. And then I got recruited by the CIA to become a CIA agent in Washington, D.C. And I thought, this is a nightmare. I'm out of here. So I moved to Canada, March 1971, crossed the bridge at Niagara Falls with a beat-up van full of guitars. And I moved to a little rural community in central Ontario, about 120 miles now, about 120 miles north of Toronto, a little near Huntsville, Ontario, near Algonquin Park. I lived in a little town called Emsdale, back 3 miles in on a dirt road. Had a little house. I bought that house for less than the price of a used car today. And I got a little 100-acre farm, little beat-up house, $7,000. Those were the days. And that was the beginning. And I didn't know anybody. I didn't have any kind of development plan for a career or anything, but I wanted to do it, and it was only 120 miles down to Toronto. And I discovered there was this whole folk world going on in Toronto at places like the Riverboat Coffee House and a couple of other little venues around the city. And I was playing in one of those venues in Toronto just as a guest set. I just went down, I didn't get paid anything. I just went down and did the 3 songs, And Estelle Klein was there, who was the founding artistic director of the Mariposa Folk Festival. And she came up and said, well, you got to come and play at Mariposa this summer. I said, okay, I will. I hardly knew what it was, but I said, okay, I will. So I went, and it was on Toronto Island, and it was really the good old days. It was just in the daytime. There was no main stage or stars. Everybody was just in these workshop stages all around the park there out on Toronto Island. And the first people I met were like John Prine, Steve Goodman, and I thought, oh, that's how you do this, okay, And they really inspired me and convinced me as I was learning that songwriting was a valid thing for someone who'd been raised in really deep traditional music to do. So I really got into the songwriting and developed a career, mostly in Ontario, playing coffee houses, university basements, little churches, whatever was going. But there was a circuit you could do back in the 70s that kind of went from the east and west dimensions of southern Ontario. So you could kind of play from Windsor all the way up to Montreal, really, all the way into Quebec and back again. And there were maybe 40 little coffee houses around that, basically along the 401 highway in all those cities from Windsor, London, Hamilton, Kitchener, Waterloo, Guelph, all the way up Kingston. All of it. But I have gone back to the States a few times to do some gigs, and gone back to do teaching at music camps and workshops, that sort of thing. But there are gigs involved. And I have lots of friends who are musicians who live in the States. So I have a lot, and I've recorded albums for Americans who've come up to do albums with me in my studio. And we talk, so we know what's going on. And I think the big difference is in the States, the music scene, even in the roots music, folk music stuff that I play, there's a sort of a territorial imperative in it. People are they're very almost protective of their space. They don't share their information quite as readily as we would here. So that that story I was saying about when I first came to Canada and I met all these guys and we all became like a family, that happens in the States, but I think it happens in a different way. And there people are more wary of each other, and they kind of hold back on sharing that information and their music a bit more. As far as the opportunities to play, I mean, it's a huge country. There's lots and lots of places to play. There's also lots of people that want to do it. So the competition factor I find in the States is really great. And because of the competition, it pulls the price down because people are willing to work for less in order to get the exposure. And I've found generally over the course of my career the rates of pay or remuneration for gigs in the United States at my level is much lower than in Canada. So what I've done in my career is I've kind of leapfrogged over to Europe, and I've performed in Europe countless times. I was signed to an Italian record company for a while, and I probably toured in Italy 30 times, and it became a real place for me, and it was like a second home. And I got paid really well. The gigs in European gigs pay really well, except in England. In England, you don't get paid much, but in Germany, Switzerland, France, Italy, Austria, the pay is superb, and they take really good care of you. And I think the biggest difference, I think it's an important thing to think about, is in the United States, people that play the kind of music I play, it's regarded as sort of entertainment. In Canada, it's regarded as a kind of part of the national identity, and it's part of what we are as Canadians because of Gordon Lightfoot and Joni Mitchell. In Europe, you're regarded as a poet and an artist. You're taken really seriously. That was the first time I ever got the real sense that what I was doing was a form of literature, as opposed to just, selling beer in a bar for somebody. And here in Canada, our best friend with that idea has been Margaret Atwood, who has proclaimed the Canadian singer-songwriter, folk singers as basically poets with guitars. That's the expression she used. Stan Rogers put everybody on the map with that idea, and he kind of paved the way for all of us to be taken more seriously. But in the States, you're still regarded as a guy up there with a guitar helping out the bar. But in Europe, it's a totally different story. And I've done gigs in Europe where they printed out all the words to my songs in a booklet and had them on the seats of the chairs so people could follow them along as I sang the songs. It was an astounding experience. Just the level of kind of artistic acceptance is much greater than anything I could have even anticipated or dreamed of. And so that's given me a lot of juice to play here in Canada too. I'd come home from Europe feeling very encouraged to keep doing what I was doing. I've spent a marvelously large portion of my career doing gigs, concerts, and festivals and workshops on the prairies, and a lot of time in eastern Alberta and Saskatchewan and Manitoba. And I have a real flavor for the people there, and a lot of Ukrainians there. So what's happening right now has really been a heartbreaker for me, because a lot of my friends are deeply affected by it. But I wanted to write a song that was kind of spoke to that Eastern Prairie mentality. So this is a lot of my songs are portraits. I think some of us make landscapes and some of us make portraits, and this is a portrait. And it's a couple from Winnipeg that go up to Fort McMurray to work for a while. That's their story. And the girl from Manitoba had a face round as the moon, and a smile that rolled me over in a backseat way too soon. And before we even knew it, popping buttons off her dress, and we loaded up my Buick, we were packed and headed west. And now I'm pushing tools at Suncor. I got an Atco double wide, a little place down off the highway, not far from Riverside. And our son's a local hero in the Crease for Junior A. We were right there in the front row the night he stopped the power play. And his sister's down in Red Deer, running hot shots on the rigs. And we hardly ever hear from her since her husband made it big. And there's a lot of talk of Houston and how the bills get paid. And we wonder what's the use in all the promises we made. There's a lot of talk of Houston and how the bills get paid. And we wonder what's the use in all the promises we made. So the house is on the market now. We'll see what it might bring. We got a fifth wheel, we can park it in the driveway till next spring. We'll run down to San Felipe, where I've heard the fishing's good. How we made it through those winters, girl, I've never understood. We'll head down to San Felipe, where I've heard the fishing's good. How we made it through those winters, girl, I never understood. I still remember that old Buick and that wide spot in the road. How we danced with Fred McMurray till the good life got us sold. And the girl from Manitoba still got that face round as the moon, and a smile still rolled me over in a backseat way too soon. And the girl from Manitoba still got that face round as the moon, and a face still rolled me over in a backseat way too soon. And her smile still rolled me over in a backseat way too soon. So this is a song that comes more out of the blues tradition that I experienced when I was a young guy, and I'm going to play it with a slide, kind of what they used to call bottleneck guitar. So it's a kind of a style that goes back to the Delta blues of Mississippi. We tend to associate it with people like Robert Johnson, but I also think of like Blind Willie McTell and Blind Blake and Blind Willie Johnson. And this particular way of playing I learned from playing actually in Canada at the folk festivals right towards the end of his career, Bucka White was coming up to Canada a lot. He was from Mississippi, and he was kind of the last of that first generation of Delta blues people who managed to still be playing long enough that many of us then young guys got to meet him. And that was a great experience playing with Bucka White, and he kind of taught us how to do this, what he called stop time rhythm, which is you kind of break the rhythm up a little bit as you're playing it. It goes like this. That old man on the corner held out his hand to beg, with a look of quiet terror in his eye. I gave that man my dollar, as to myself I said, there but for the grace of God go I. Yeah, there but for the grace, oh, there but for the grace that's shining down upon me from on high. I gave that man my dollar, as to myself I said, there but for the grace of God go I.